science and structurals, equivalence, giving it a unique definition. I think another thing that needs to be done, I think Cohen and Richard Cohen versus the quote from much of the work that's being done in neurobiology, neuropsychology, and origin of life studies it's working with this assumption that only something that has a material cause can be studied. As I try to explicate what I'm saying. However, I think that's the last we can go back. Thoroughgoing, robust critique of Cohen's assumptions that non-physical conceptions of life cannot be empirically investigated and tested. I think this is an assumption that is not something part of science proper. It's not part of the true. It's not an intrinsic part of science. And it's something that can be investigated and should be investigated, as well as the claims made by great contemplative traditions about the nature of non-physical consciousness. Leave on out of time, so thank you for your attention.
Una piccola informazione, rimane, prima non è intervenuto adesso in questa sessione perché c'è stato un fraintendimento, lui nel momento dell'invocazione ha fatto la sua presentazione, quindi per questo motivo non c'è stato rimane. Scusate.
Yeah, I think you've touched upon absolutely fundamental question about the challenge to this view. If the consciousness is, as I said, non-physical, then how is it that our body and brain have such a profound impact upon our state of consciousness? To give an example of pain. Yes, I think it's a big question, and my quick answer would be that, as I said, this tradition, this is what I believe, this is the tradition I practice, that the body and mind are very much alike. There is a psychosomatic unity between the body and mind. So when the brain is affected, we obviously know this neurobiology. I think finding the Ayurveda thousands of years ago that it's going to affect your state of consciousness. And that's, like I said, I think it's because the consciousness which is outside of the psychosomatic structure, which is outside of the body and mind, is so much identifying with these two realms of reality, the mind and the body. But it is nevertheless something different. And it's through this identification that when the mind, where brain is affected, the mind is also affected, and that we feel the consequences of this. I'm not sure how well that is.
Thank you. Lei? Você tem uns contra-introdutos? Tem que explicar agora.
Well, should I wait for a
For
microphone?
Mr. Edman?
Yes, please.
It's for you.
Okay. Well, I'm actually relatively sympathetic to some of the notions you said about consciousness, but one thing I'm somewhat uncomfortable with is there. If I understood you correctly, you seem to be almost identifying consciousness with life, and when I look at the plants here, that seems to be a bit of a stretch. So I guess in that sense, I mean, if I'm correct about that, it would seem to me that the viewpoint one said earlier about untestability comes into play. So how do you avoid consciousness with life being a tautology? I mean, if anything is alive that has consciousness, it seems there's no distinction in the concept. So that's basically the question. Can we really honestly say consciousness is a meaningful concept when it comes to a plant?
Again, excellent question. Fundamental problem. Yeah, it is definitely a stretch. Again, I have to return to what I just said before, that on this, it's an extrapolation. It's an extrapolation between saying, this is what I've discovered about my own consciousness. I'm going to extrapolate this into understanding that other things are also conscious in the same way that I am. However, there the word I'm going to use is covered by different sorts of biological forms. On the view of Bhagavata, pure consciousness enters into different types of biological forms, plants, animals, amoebas, whatever. And once it enters into that particular form, once it begins identifying with that form, it's governed by the laws or the capacities, the abilities of that particular form. It's a very foreign view. I think to return to the movie analogy, I think you choose to go into the horror film, then you're going to get scared, hopefully. If you go into the love story, you're going to fall in love. If you go into the adventure story, you're going to feel adventure. So I think the analogy holds that when you enter a human body, you get into an experience. When you enter a plant body, when the purest self enters into a plant body, you get the plant experience. And in terms of it being a tautology, to a certain extent, I think it is a tautology to define life as consciousness and consciousness as life. But what's happening is, like I said, it's an extrapolation. This is what I've learned about myself. I'm going to verify that anybody in this room is conscious. It could all be a hologram created by, the holodeck on the Star Trek. We could be in the Matrix. There's no way of me telling you anything or anyone's consciousness. I assume you're conscious because you're at your aspect of it. So the extrapolation holds is necessary, not completely material. I don't know if this is part of it.
Ci sono altre domande? Ci passate il microfono, signora. Lei che mai
Ho potuto constatare di persona tramite meditazioni che Dio...
Scusi signora, a chi rivolge la domanda?
Ah, signore.
È domanda.
Tutti coloro che chiamiamo Dio è l'esistenza. È l'esistenza, è quello che ho constatato io di persona tramite questa meditazione, che l'energia divina è una corrente enorme. La domanda è: tutti noi siamo esseri autocreati?
Are you asking if we've been created? Are we self-created? We've been self-created. Well, creation itself is an interesting word. I mean, to say something is created means it didn't exist beforehand. So as I briefly said, this view that life is beginningless, and therefore it's not created. Because to say it was created would mean that it hadn't existed prior to its created existence. Again, maybe it's a bit of a language game, but in my view, life is dependent on greater source. Maybe not created by a greater source, but it's in the sense of having been brought into being. But it's dependent upon a greater source of divine and divinity, God, Bhagavan, of Krishna. And that's one has to understand oneself in reference to that entity, that supreme being upon whom we are dependent. Well, I hope that answers your question.
Abbiamo finito, non si può più domandare. È tempo di pranzo. It's finished from now till 20 past 2. Jusqu'à 2h20. I'm sorry people don't think they don't have time to have to work. So.
No, parlava dell'Hare Krishna.
Sì, ma gli Hare Krishna non mi piacciono dal punto di vista. Invece i buddisti.
Sì. Guarda. Metti in
Mica tanto. No.
Good afternoon. We will begin this afternoon session. We are late by half an hour, but we are making our best to go on. will be listening to 4 distinguished speakers this afternoon, specialists each of them, and on some of the current issues related to our theme. The first speaker is Dr. Jagdish Srivastava, who is a highly regarded statistician affiliated to the University of Colorado in the United States. He has written extensively not only in his own field but also on science and religion, in particular the Vedanta religion. He has published many articles for the Bhaktivedanta Institute, and it's now my privilege to introduce him. All the speakers have promised me that they won't take even 5 seconds more to get out of a lot of this. Thank you.
I said, don't be practical when you were mathematical. It's only in this practice. I do feel greatly to have done mathematical work. And this is not the place, to start in. I cannot start giving you the proof of, modern sophisticated mathematics. However, what I am going to present to you is a result from that mathematics. But I will present to you in layman's language. Well, life and its origins, of course, is a very important subject. Probably it should be the most important subject for human beings. You should know what is our origin. And so, I would like to congratulate the Bhaktivedanta Institute for conceiving of the importance of holding this conference. Previous speakers today have talked about Darwin's theory. Dr. Raman in the start, we have referred to that. You know what Darwin's theory is about. That initially there was soup, which is was ocean from where bacteria grew and bigger organisms and bigger and so on, and finally humans evolved out of that. So that is the Darwin's theory of the evolution of bodies. Then there is an extrapolation from that which I would call neo-Darwinism. Neo-Darwinism assumes, and by the way, that is something that a lot of people are doing. They assume that life is a product of the body. And because now, if Darwin's theory is correct, and since bodies have evolved, so if life is a product of the body, then life has evolved. This is what they conclude. This conclusion is neo-Darwinism. I am aware of this. I am interested in science and spirituality for exactly 40 years. Since 1964, I started doing research in it, not just learning parallelisms or developing philosophies, but actually doing research into it, just like I do research in mathematics or physics and so on. Now, this thing called 13:19. I have set before you life and death, blessing and cursing. God is saying that to Lord Moses. Choose thou life, so that thou and thy seed may live. Well, the person to whom God is talking has a body. So therefore, if body implies life, then this statement is meaningless. Because God will be saying, well, you who have a body and therefore have a life, now you choose life. This will be meaningless. So therefore, I concluded from this. And by the way, I take spirituality and the scriptures very seriously. So I concluded from that life is not a part of the body. God is not talking about this, what we call sexual reproduction. It's a greater thing. So therefore I set about thinking on this matter in 1964. Now, I will show to you today, I proved actually mathematically, and I will show to you why life is not a part of the body. And because it is not, so therefore this assumption is contradicted here. And therefore, neo-Darwinism is dead. Nothing can be done against mathematical theorems. Well, so people have been talking of life as being the ability to reproduce. Well, that's not so. That's not the definition of life. That couldn't be. Otherwise, Deuteronomy 13:19 would get contradicted, and that is the truth. That cannot be contradicted. So I say there is a whole mathematical theory of self-reproducing automata. My friend in France, Marshall we were working in 1959 on that. Soon we are going to be self-reproducing machines in the next 30 years. So they will be alive. So what I say is that life means the ability to be self-conscious. That is the truth of human life. By the way, later on, in the early 70s, I think I came across this book, Life Comes from Life, by A.C. Bhaktivedanta. The Bhaktivedanta Institute is named after him. He was a very great saint, and I was very impressed with this book. And I started thinking of how to prove this thing mathematically. The good news is that I have shown to physics and mathematics that neo-Darwinism is false. Body and life inside the body are two separate things. I have a body and there is life inside my body, and these two are two separate things. My body will imply life. My theory, which will be denoted by DK, upholds the scriptures. Now I will begin to explain it in detail. There will be an analogy. Think of a TV set. So suppose this thing is a TV set and you are watching a program on this TV set. Now I maintain that the program is a result of two things. This box here, which is called the TV set, and the signal that is coming from some antenna. And the The living human being corresponds to the program. Our physical body corresponds to the exterior of the TV set, and our mind corresponds to the interior of the TV set. And life, which means the consciousness within us, that corresponds to the electromagnetic signal. So that is the basic correspondence from the layman's point of view. Now I will tell you, give an example of how Darwinism has come to impress people. Imagine a town in Sahara where no one ever heard of an electromagnetic wave. Okay, the signal that comes in the TV. Now in this town there is a factory where TV is being built for the last 50 years. The signal comes from Italy, but no one in this town knows about that signal. Now, a child was born there 50 years ago. Now the child is 50 years old. What is the perspective of this child? Think about it. So this child has been watching from his childhood that you see earlier that the TV set was made in a particular way. It was crude and became better. Black and white pictures and colored pictures and so on, better and better. So this child, who is now 50 years old, he concludes that there has been an evolution. Similarly, there are 40, 60, 80-year-old children here in the world today who have somehow concluded that there has been an evolution. Well, there has been an evolution of bodies totally, but I'm not going to do that. But this 50-year-old child doesn't know that there is a signal that is coming from Italy. He's never heard about it. So he assumes that when the TV set is built, it automatically starts playing the program. He has never heard of the signal. He doesn't know that this is based on Italy, where the signals are coming and they are playing inside this. So I hope that this example proves the way, explains to you what I'm trying to do. The TK had, it firstly approached Plato. Plato said, more than 2,000 years ago, he said that all physical objects, for example, a pen, exist only in the name of idea. An idea, like I love Italian food. So you see, I have a pen here, it's a physical object. I love Italian food, that's an idea. What is the difference? A physical object I can hold, put it in my pocket, put it here, throw it and so on. Idea, I can't put that in my pocket, can't hold it. See, that's the difference. Yet you see, Plato, the philosopher, maintained that physical objects, though they look like physical objects, they are actually in the name of ideas. I accept that, and I go one step further. And that step is called axiom 1. It says that all objects in nature are only logical mathematical objects. All logical mathematical objects are objects in nature. So this is the fundamental assumption. There are a lot of philosophies in the world, lots of theories, science and religion and so on. And of course, theory DK is in competition with all of them. But unlike them, this theory has only one assumption, and that assumption is quite strongly backed. Now, it is also in the name of physics, so therefore, on the physics part, one will have to refer to my articles in physics, and then there is a non-physics part, and I will summarize that. Now, has no consciousness. Animate entities are those with consciousness. So light, that thing has light, which has consciousness. The consciousness of an animate entity, E, gives to E the experience of physical reality. That is, certain objects in nature which are all, of course, logical mathematical objects, are experienced as physical objects. So what is happening is that actually, although objects in nature are only logical mathematical objects, consciousness of animate entities converts those logical metaphysical objects into objects that are physical. On just one assumption explains also how the experience of physicality arises. The experience is, however, not unique. The same logical mathematical object may give entirely different experiences of physicality to different living entities. For example, color. You see this dark, the red dark. Okay? A color corresponds to a sine wave. Sine wave like this. And it has this equation. Now, humans may see a green color, but the lion will see the gray. This dark here, the light, you see, will be seen by you as a red dark, but the lion will see as a gray dark. And why? Because the lion's consciousness is also dependent on the body. So therefore, lion's consciousness, it doesn't see this color. So it is not that there is a physical object there. Actually, there is only a mathematical object, and it is being perceived differently by different animate entities. Example 2. There are some high-frequency sounds which humans cannot hear, but some insects do. The same set of blood molecules may cause an odor that is perceptible to certain dogs, but not humans. Humans will pass by a murdered person in a bush and not perceive anything, but the dog will feel that there is something there. See, there is a difference in consciousness, and that difference is arising out of this difference in the body. The same fruit may be able to taste to one, and this able to another. One, for example, is smooth for us, not for the spider. So, all these different behavior examples from every sense that we have, every sense organ, and so it is dependent on the body. Consciousness, now how to define that? Consciousness is not a physical object. Like my body is a physical object. But an attribute. Like age. Like you see, on my next birthday, I will be more than 36 years old. so that's an attribute. Just as there is space in the physical world, there is consciousness in the logical world. So, my dear friends, if there is only one sentence in which I can summarize my work, is this. We seemingly look, it seems like we look in the physical world. Actually, it is that we look in a logical mathematical, we live in a logical mathematical world. It's a world of ideas. That is why I think Jesus, when he was walking on the Sea of Galilee, he was there, he rebuked the wave, and the wave calmed down. Because the waves are ideas, he just changed them. He changed the idea. I can say something and I can change it. See, it's in the realm of ideas. That's everything is happening. So if Albert Einstein was here, I would simply tell him that I agree with him in a lot of things that he says, except for one thing. He said it's only action and distance. There isn't any smooth action and distance. explain to you the nature of consciousness. Suppose that I take a container, I will take this glass here. See, this is a container. Okay, so if in this glass you put some objects, then the space inside that glass will reduce, right? So the physical space, this glass is an enclosure, and it encloses a certain amount of space inside it. And if you will put some objects inside this glass, then that space will get further reduced. Okay? Similarly, the I, you, and each of us is like a container. And this container is in the logical space, it's a container. And what is happening is that our aversions and attachments and what we have, these are logical objects inside this container. So they reduce our consciousness. If we get rid of these aversions and attachments and so on, the scriptures are teaching us, see, then we develop higher consciousness. And by the way, that is the source of life. Okay. Okay, so now I want to define this. Time is short, so I will be fast. First is cognizance. Any two freely acting objects, A and B, in nature, are said to be cognizant of each other. For example, zinc and sulfuric acid. So if you take some zinc and some sulfuric acid, put it together in the air, the zinc molecules are cognizant of the structure of the sulfuric acid molecules and vice versa. This is cognizance. But the zinc molecule is not cognizant of the statement that it is cognizant of the sulfuric acid molecule. A is said to be conscious of B if A is cognizant of the statement that A is cognizant of B. See, A is cognizant of B merely because they are creating objects. But for A to be conscious, A has to be cognizant of that statement that A is cognizant of B. And this now brings you into deep waters in the subjects of logic and mathematics. Very deep waters. This is called Gödel's self-reference. Here you are referring to yourself. And this is the crux of the matter. This is what the nature of consciousness. The question that I have is, how does consciousness arise? And I will answer that myself. So, to answer this, the introduced firstly is set V, the totally empty set. The totally empty set V is a subset of every set in nature, but it does not contain any element of any set in nature. So V is a subset of the set of people in this room, but it doesn't contain any person of this room. V is a subset of the set of all pens in Italy, but it doesn't contain any pen in Italy. V is the subset of all fish in the Adriatic Sea, but it does not contain any fish in the Adriatic Sea. So and so on, every possible conceivable set. Okay? So this is the totally empty set V. And my dear friends, this V corresponds to the Supreme Divine. Now, as I said, you see, proving and too much of discussion of maths is out of this talk. So I will just give you some simple, conclusion on this. First conclusion is that there is one and only one V, of course, just of mathematics. And so it implies that God is one. I just put it, for example, in the Quran. not so. I have defined V to you, and it's pretty clear. If you give me any set, well, I will say yes, V is a subset of the set, but V doesn't contain any element of the set. So it's quite understandable what V is. However, V is beyond our concept, right? Because it is not possible to enumerate all possible sets. Now we want to deep mathematics here. It is not possible to make any list of all possible sets. Such a list would not exist. In fact, things are far different than that. So V is beyond our concepts, and because V is independent of the concept of time and space, V is beginningless. V is nowhere, being totally empty, and so therefore you can say that there is no God. Just as many Buddhists and as Jains said. On the other hand, since we are talking about it, we can take the attitude that V is there, so we can talk about there is God. And that is the attitude in the Jewish, Islamic, Christian, Sikh and religions. So both things are there. And because of that reason, this piece of abstract mathematics here, it corresponds directly to the line 13-12 of the Bhagavad Gita. Krishna says that God is beginningless and beyond all concepts and cannot be called existent, non-existent, real or unreal. Now, Gödel said that all of mathematics are evolved out of V, and because of that reason, it follows that all of nature evolved out of V. So everything has evolved out of the Supreme God. That's this theory. V is omnipresent and omnipotent. V is fully conscious of our nature. This is a theorem. V is totally unconditioned. V is far and near. V is one that may appear to many. V is personal but may seem impersonal. We may seem to have no attributes, but we can regard it with any attribute. And such an unconditional, supreme divine, I call that divine by the name of Krishna. So that's my definition of the word Krishna. Question: how can we create anything being like a zero? After V is a totally empty set, so totally empty set, how is it creating? Well, it creates, you see, because of infinity sitting there. Now look at this, this is very interesting. Here I have written a series called infinite series. 1 over 1 minus 1 over 1 plus half minus half, 1 over 3 minus 1 over 3 and so on. 1 over 1000 minus 1 over 1000 and so on. Now if I divide this, as the first two terms you get 0, the next two terms 0 and so on. Obviously you see you keep adding, so long as you will have a even number of terms, you will get 0. And what will happen to your odd number of terms? You will get one extra term, you see, so you will be this term after 1000 terms, and so on, and it will keep increasing. So it's clear that actually this series is nothing but 0. However, you will be surprised to know that the series can be summed to any number that you want. I mean, if you want the sum to be 23, I can give you. Minus 45, square root of 2, any number. If you want it to keep fluctuating forever, whatever you want. And this is a simple illustration of the fact that God seems to you the way God, that's the way God is looking at you. Ye Paramahansa Prabhu Master. Okay, now. Well, this is the main theorem of this paper, and I have copies here for those people who want it. It says that any entity has this abstract mathematical form. It must involve this V, and W applies the restrictions on V, and X the physical body of V. So this is the basic result. And from this result, you see, I can prove here that this is what is happening in a universe where time is defined. W and X are changing constantly. When X dies, then this happens. W1 is divided by W to become of the death of X. And then W1 acts like an engine, which creates another body X1, and then this keeps on. And this is how life gives rise to life. Life comes from life. It is here that I proved it. And life actually is arising without V. V is the source, the signal. Life is not a product of the body X. And this is how neo-Darwinism is constructed. I'm sorry, I have more to present, but there's no time. I have 30 minutes on this. So I will start off right now.
Thank you, Dr. Srivastava, for showing us how with mathematics we can do anything that we really don't understand. I think during the question and answer period, we can explore the topics much more. Every speaker, if we are constrained to end in half an hour, I hope we'll have time to explore it further. Our next speaker is Professor Mann, Robert Mann, who is Professor of Applied Mathematics and at the University of Waterloo in Canada. He has an MSc and PhD from the University of Toronto. He has been a postdoctoral fellow at Harvard and a visiting scientist at the University of California and in Cambridge. His specialization is in black holes and cosmology. He's also currently president of the Canadian Society, Canadian Scientific and Prestigious Association. Dr. Mann.
Thank you. Well, good, thanks. So while the slides are being called up, just let me say buongiorno. That's the only Italian you'll hear from me. It's not, mine is not nearly as good as Dr. Ross's, so I'm certainly not going to give my talk in Italian. I would like to thank Dr. Singh for inviting me here and for his organization of the conference and for the help of the others in putting this meeting together about life and its origins. And as we are waiting for the projector to come up, which I'm kind of hoping it will, talks never used to have this level of suspense before data projectors came in, but now every time that happens, you always have this little element of suspense, wondering if the talk's going to go on. I've become interested over the years, in recent years, as to the impact of Darwinian thinking on religious faith and on spiritual paradigms, not only my own in Christianity, but more generally in the sense that I think there is a genuine tension between the Darwinian paradigm and religious perhaps spiritual ways of thinking. I'm optimistic enough, some might say naive enough, to believe that this tension perhaps can one day be satisfactorily resolved. But that being said, I think it's a fair statement to say that it is not fully resolved at this point in history, and it does present us with significant conundrums that we need to address. So how are we doing with the machine there? Let me say that I think the main level of tension between these two ideas is reflected in what I like to call the telic and the ekbatic. And these are words derived from Greek words. Telic refers to the notion of purpose from the Greek word telos, or final cause, and it refers to situations in which something is done for a motive, for a purpose, to achieve a given end. And most religious faiths understand things in that kind of term. We do something to attain a final goal, perhaps to attain enlightenment, to attain some kind of unity with God, or something of that nature. At the other end, or the other paradigm is called the ekbatic one. This word is not very commonly used, but it comes from the Greek word ekbatos, which means that which proceeds out of necessity, or from a law-like pattern, or constraint. And this tends to be the paradigm underlying all scientific sorts of investigations. So in other words, when we understand, for example, a weather pattern, or water flowing down the river, or the behavior of atoms as they combine to form molecules, these things are not understood in terms of the purpose of the clouds, or the motivation of the river, or the desire of the atoms. Rather, in a scientific framework, we make the meta-hypothesis, shall we say, that these things are all following natural laws that are not governed by any any deliberate motivation or intent of any particular individual or set of individuals necessarily. And it's here where the tension comes in, because when it comes to Darwinism, from a religious perspective, and we've seen some of this at this meeting already, people would prefer to understand the origin of life in a telic context. We'd like to think that life is here because there is some reason for it to be here. This happens not only at a large-scale meta level, as we heard, I think, from Dr. Rivera this morning in terms of God's intent, but also even at a micro level. We ask, what is the purpose of our own life? Where is our own life going? Different way, perhaps, of saying the origin of life concept, as Bhaktivedanta said earlier. Yet, in the Darwinian paradigm, life is understood as arising through an evolutionary process that, as its most vocal components tend to say, seems to be rather arbitrary and mindless. Not mindless in the sense there are no physical laws being followed, but mindless in the sense of no purpose. So perhaps purposelessness would be a better way of describing it. We say that this life arises without purpose. So there is a tension between these two ways of understanding things. And what I wanted to present here in terms of the cosmology and cosmogony of life, which I'm really hoping might get working here, is very recently there's been an application of this paradigm to cosmology itself. And it's a rather creative idea presented by Lee Smolin. I wish I could take credit for it myself, but I can't. But what he attempted to do was unite the Darwinian paradigm of understanding with the cosmological paradigm of understanding. And the proposal goes something as follows. Basically, the universe itself is the product of an evolutionary process amongst a set of meta-universes, and the particular one that we happen to live in happens to be the result not of any creator necessarily, but rather because of an emphatic, in my terms, process that gave rise to it. Okay, good, we're finally up and running. And this idea, I think, will have significant implications for cosmological and religious thought. And I'm going to challenge the idea somewhat here, but rather what I want to do is actually throw out the notion that this is an idea that should challenge us. Now, I believe the talk is on the desktop there, isn't it? That wasn't so hard, was it? Okay, so let's get to the next slide. So, just very briefly to review, I say the reason why there's continuing controversy over creation and evolution is because of this tension between, between the telic and the emphatic. So if I could have the next one. This is an unresolved paradigm conflict, I claim, between science that arises from universal Darwinism. Next. So it's what I said before, teleology versus eschatology. Next. Keep going. So theology's approach is understanding things in terms of purpose. And I said a little bit about this, so I won't go on with it. Whereas science's approach tends to be one of eschatology, understanding things in terms of some combination of necessity and chance. So universal Darwinism, keep pushing the button, has three ingredients. One is replication. We have identifiable things called replicators that make copies of themselves. In life, these are the genes, but you could have other things. Then we have variation. Copying is not perfect. The Xerox machine of the natural world makes tiny errors, and so each copy typically differs slightly from its replicated parent. And finally, we have selection. This happens in the context of an environment, and the efficiency of a given replicator to copy itself depends on this surrounding environment. So if you add those ingredients up together, what you get is called evolution. Next. So differential reproduction and survival yield apparently designed structures. And this is where, of course, the tension comes in, because a telic approach would say they are actually designed in some sense, whereas industrial strength evolution would say no, actual design doesn't exist, there is only inherent design. I'm stating things in the extreme here to highlight the point. So what's this? So theology's greatest challenge, just keep clicking. We have a bunch of imperfect replicators. They are put into an environment. If we wait long enough, universal Darwinism says we're going to get structure without purpose. So there's no teleology. So you might ask, what's all this got to do with cosmology? And let me briefly mention that. We live on a planet orbiting a galaxy that is in an expanding universe that began explosively about 13 billion years ago. Actually, our best information says it's 13.7 billion years, plus or minus 2%. So we believe this for several reasons. There's a huge detail underlying it, but basically, we observed the expansion. That was done in the late 1920s and has been defined ever since. We observed the heat from the explosion in the context of the microwave background radiation. We see the debris from the explosion. We can calculate precisely from the laws of physics the ratios of the elements in empty space. Most of it's hydrogen, about 74%. The next, almost 1/4 is helium, and then there's a scattering of light elements, lithium and beryllium and so on. The ratios of all these elements in empty space have been predicted precisely and are in high accord with what is observed. So we actually see the debris. Back up a bit, please. And then finally, we can also measure the fine details of cosmic structure.